This is Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing. I'm Rachel Gordon. Here we aim to make the process of writing and publishing a bit more transparent and a bit less overwhelming. Through conversations with editors and academics at all stages, from full professors to graduate students, independent scholars, and postdocs, we share stories, lessons, and helpful habits from our writing lives. We're really excited today to get to speak with Jenna Weissman Joselit, the George Washington University Charles E. Smith Professor of Judaic Studies and Professor of History, and the author of many books, including the recent biography, Mordecai M. Kaplan, Restless Soul, published by Yale. Welcome, Jenna.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here.
You've written so many books before you turned to Mordecai Kaplan, and so I was really interested, what made you turn to biography now?
I wish I had some kind of magical answer, but it was a very simple one. I was asked. This came out of the blue, and I was asked, and I jumped right in. I would say I plunged right in. Maybe I should have hesitated a bit, but I didn't. I just grabbed at this. It wasn't something that I had thought about. I had written profiles of people and sketches, that kind of thing. But my jam is really material culture and daily life. And so spend a lot of time with objects. I guess you could say that I'm a biographer of objects, but I've never written about a person. But of course, I knew of Mordecai Kaplan. I had even used his diary a long time ago and knew what a gorgeous source that was. And I was ready to stretch. I was ready to try my hand at something new. And the opportunity to write the very first full-fledged account of Kaplan and his life. He lived to be 102. And the most contemporary account, the previous and sole biography dated to 1993. So here was a chance to contribute to the literature. And for all these reasons, I just said, yes, I really didn't hesitate. It wasn't just that Kaplan himself was one of these larger-than-life characters and so attractive, but I love the diary, and I knew what a gold mine it was, and it was an extraordinary source, and it turned out to exceed my expectations. So for all of those reasons, I wish I could say that there was a burning desire to tackle a person. No, now I have it. Now I have the bug. But I didn't, and I also knew that the Yale series was a very unusual series. I published as part of the Yale Jewish Lives series, which places a premium on concision, on being very compact. So it's not the usual cradle to grave and everything in between kind of account. I knew it was more of a think piece, kind of an interpretation, and that appealed to me too. So for all of these reasons, I jumped in, I plunged, and I'm very happy. It really changed my life, really.
What you say brings up an important point for listeners, which is that you were invited, and many listeners are wondering, how do I make sure that I get invited for interesting writing projects? I don't know if the editors who invited you wrote or spoke to you about, Jenna, you've done this and that, and so this is why we know you'd be great, even if this never occurred to you before. But what's your understanding of why you were invited?
I know that the editors knew my work. So there's one key. You just keep on being as productive as possible. Make sure you're out there in as many different outlets, which I'm sure we'll get to soon, as many different outlets as possible. And I didn't ask them, why me? What were you thinking? Because I'm not the obvious candidate. I'm not an intellectual historian. But I think that they, because they knew my work and they knew my attention to detail and my strong love of writing, and I think capacity for writing, that I'd be a good bet for this. And also, they were interested in the life rather than the specific philosophical musings. And since my bailiwick is 20th century American Jewish life, I was pretty good on the mise en scène, the larger context. And I think that they thought, and I hope I did right by that thought, that I'd be a good person to kind of figure out what made Mordecai Kaplan tick. So I think I rose to the challenge. Whether I acquitted myself well, I don't know. But I certainly had a damn fine time trying.
Yeah. As you mentioned, Mordecai Kaplan has written so much. How did you approach the question of which of his writings you'd actually include in, as you said, this pretty concise biography of someone who lived so
Right.
long?
Because I didn't pay attention to the writings. I paid attention to the life. And I was much more intrigued by how the life gave rise to the writings rather than the other way around. Most accounts, I would say 98% of the accounts about Kaplan focus on his writings and try through the lens of the writings to get a sense of who he was. But who he was secondary to what he wrote. I flipped the script. I was really interested in what made him tick and who he was. And in a way, the book is as much a profile of American Jews of the 20th century as it is of him. So that focus, I knew I couldn't encompass everything, and I knew I couldn't possibly read every single thing he wrote. I came pretty close, though. And so that was one framing device. The other, as I said before, was Yale's emphasis on taught account. And so I knew I couldn't possibly explore every single thing that he wrote. And then also, I was very intrigued by Kaplan's love of words, the primacy of words. And that's a kind of leitmotif. He loved talk, high-minded talk, not priddle-paddle talk. I mean, he loved intellectual exchange. He loved teaching. He loved sermonizing. He loved writing. It was hard for him, but he loved writing. And the diary, which spans over 70 years and a goodly portion of every year, reflects the primacy of language and of words and of ideas. So that helped shape the narrative, too. I did worry, was I leaving out some critical things? But at a certain point, having immersed myself, living with him, I say in my acknowledgments that there were times that I lived more with him than I did with my husband. He just kind of took over our lives. And so I had a sense of him. And once I was able to figure out my organizational scheme, it just took shape. That took a long time. And I was thinking at one point of being very experimental, maybe starting from the end and working back, or making Kaplan more of a character in his own life. I was just trying with different ways. I read widely, all sorts of different biographical encounters. But ultimately, I decided that chronology here was my friend, and though I didn't want to do a very explicit kind of chronology, moving over time was the way to go, especially because he himself moves over time and he's continuously changing his stripes over time. So I don't know if that really answers the question, but that's sort of how it helped. At a certain point, I wouldn't say these narratives write themselves, but once you find the pivot, once you're kind of there and you think, okay, I'm committing to this way, things fall sort of into place. They have to be goosed into place, but they do line up in a way, and then you see themes that run throughout and you try to echo various themes without being too heavy-handed. And before you know it, you're done. I'm making it sound very easy. It wasn't very easy, but it does have a momentum. That's very unique to biography because you're tracing a life which has a beginning and a middle and an end, and then an aftermath and a legacy. When you're looking at phenomena, it's not quite as neatly framed, So I decided let chronology help me as opposed to be an obstacle or just something that constrained me.
As you said, you were tracing a life. And so I'm wondering, did this mean you had this timeline set out? And were you trying to figure out which are my important dramatic moments that will become chapters? Or how did you sort of divide up the life?
So, as I said at the outset, and your initial questions touched on it, biography is not my strong suit, wasn't my strong suit. It was nothing. I had never really done it. And intellectual history is also not what I do. And also because my mandate was not a series of negations, but I didn't want to go down the usual path. And I also wanted to be true to everything else that I've worked on and to somehow be able to integrate the material cultural aspect. And I, for the life of me now, in response to your question about this, your advanced question, I was trying to reconstruct, no pun intended, how I hit on my chapter titles and then how that helped to frame and shape the narrative. For the life of me, I don't remember, but I did know that once I decided that an object would be the chapter title. It gave me my frame. So thinking about a sermon as an object, a blueprint as an object, words as objects, portraits as objects, yeah. And then there were a number of very key moments. His life supplied me with those key moments. I could not reckon with those key moments. So they somehow were lodestars that enabled me to frame the narrative around those lodestars. And little by little, I had one chapter after the other. Again, that's magical. It's always magical, right? So no bullets. And I'm sure somebody coming along in a couple of years will write another biography. We'll look at different things. But I found, for example, when Kaplan was just beginning, he got into a lot of hot water when it came to the importance of delivering a sermon. So I thought, make the sermon kind of the intro, and make the sermon. I didn't want to have a chapter on Kaplan and his controversies, but it became clear very early on that the sermon was going to be a controversy. And then the next thing he did was a controversy. So there are certain themes along the way that were like a current that kept the book moving, but were not signaled as such. Oh, current controversy, but the reader would pick up along the way the drama of Kaplan's life. And so that's how I would organize it, or blueprint. He comes up with all these ideas. Musical chairs, that was a wonderful chapter, I think, where Kaplan becomes very involved in creating yet another newfangled kind of synagogue. And he's called on to weigh in on what kinds of chairs they want. And this was not something that was ever part of his portfolio. And so the humor, the irony, the level of detail that this man who lives in his head is being called on to weigh in. Should they be brown faux leatherette, or should they be velvet, faux velvet? It just struck me as really funny. And then it turned out that the idea of musical chairs really lends itself to his own restlessness, and he's constantly looking for greener pastures. So things just kind of fell into place because I was attentive to these otherwise insignificant details. So that's kind of how that worked. And then portraits, I was really struck at the number of portraits that there were of Kaplan. And then the portrait chapter became my way of pulling it all together and to reconciling how Kaplan appeared publicly. And the fact that he agreed to his portraits suggested that he was willing literally to have a public face, but how he was inwardly, and the tensions between the two. And that provided an opportunity not only to show some of the portraits, but to talk about kind of the disconnect and the restlessness that was at his core, and his sense of not quite succeeding. So all of these things, they talk to one another, they play with one another. But I had the conceit first, and then put the material into that container.
Yeah, that last one you mentioned, that you spent the last chapter on the many portraits of him, struck me as one that really drew on well, they all do, but drawing on your strengths as a scholar of material culture, and something that you particularly bring to his biography. Did you get any pushback from the editors? Because it's kind of a idiosyncratic sort of look at him. I mean, I think it really works, but it's probably wasn't anything they thought of originally.
I don't know that they thought. I mean, they were open. They knew what they were getting. They knew who I was, and they knew the kinds of questions I put to my material and the way I write, and how I do place a premium on things that a lot of people do not. So they knew it. No. The only pushback I got was that I ran over my deadline, my word count. They're very strict on the word count. I never run over in fact, I run under my word count, always. But this time, I had so much, even though a lot of stuff ended up on the cutting room floor, or I just didn't entertain the idea of going there. So I had to make a case, which was pretty funny. I had to make a case to the Yale powers that be as to why I violated my contract and went over, not by a zillion words, but by enough to give them pause. And that the main reason was not my verbosity, but the fact that Kaplan lived to be 102 and lived a very long and very productive life for most of it, whereas most of the characters in the Yale series lived a full life, but 50 years shy of Kaplan's. Mm-hmm. And so I just had to go over, once I made my case, they were okay with it. So that was really the only pushback I got. The other was And this is kind of fascinating. You know how, I mean, I'm sure you do this too. You write your intro and your conclusion pretty much at the same time. In my case, the intro was the very last thing I wrote. And some of the Yale people, not so much the outside readers or my editors, but the Yale people who don't know anything about American Jewish life, or very little about American Jewish life, certainly very little about or nothing about Kaplan, felt that I was still a little bit too inside baseball, and they wanted to push me a little harder into making a case as to why Kaplan was in this series. And I felt, do I have to? Do I have to make the case? I mean, he's, to those of us in the know, of course he warrants a place in this series. And to try to explain who he is the mandate, the remit of the book, or to try and squish it in. So I wrote the introduction, at least the first 2 or 3 pages of the introduction, and certainly the first 2 or 3 paragraphs at least 10 times. I kept on writing and writing. I just couldn't get it right because it seemed to me too heavy-handed, too didactic, too obvious. And then I got it. So that was the other pushback, and I'm grateful for it. At the time, I wasn't so grateful for it. I thought what I had to say was just fine, thank you. But ultimately, they were right to push me to make more explicit what I wanted to be more implicit. And I love my very first sentence. Can I read it to you?
Yeah, of course.
A great sentence. Yeah, that sentence alone, it looks so neat and tidy on the page, and that took so much doing. So what do I say in my very first sentence? I say, his friends likened him to a seismograph, his enemies to a heretic, his students to a holy terror. And then I was off. I just really wanted to make the case that from the get-go, this is a complex, round, very difficult person, and we're off. And from that point, I went off. So.
Yeah, I think it's the first page or 2 really has this momentum, and you do that helpful thing of sort of packing in. It's almost like a list kind of sort of what he's done and why he's important. And I guess you're saying maybe that's what you came to as the way to make the case.
Right.
Yeah, that's really effective. As you mentioned, very long life, I think 102 years Kaplan lived. So were there parts of his life that you decided at some point, I'm not really going to be spending much time on these sections?
I didn't want to devote a section to each one of the books that he wrote. And some of the reviewers thought maybe I should have given more attention to X or to Y, but that was a judgment call because the book was, as I say, more about the life. So I managed, I think, to put a lot in, and a lot in that people didn't know. I imagine most people didn't know that he lived in Jerusalem between 37 and 39, and that was a very pivotal time for him. I think that they did not know that there was a big essay contest that midwifed the birth of Judaism as a civilization. I think they didn't know that in the 50s, he was extremely, extremely busy, not only with the University of Judaism creating that institution, but trying to come up with new ways of reckoning with Zionism and statehood, and also that he had a marvelous marriage of over 50 years, and he didn't anticipate, after his first remarkable wife, Lena, dies, that he would remarry a year later to an equally remarkable woman and to cast his lot with her, she being a native of Jerusalem. And so he changes the geography of his life, and that has very profound consequences, not always very happy ones for him. So I think in many ways, I didn't want to go with the tried and true. I wanted to expand the parameters of his life, the depths of his life. So I went in directions that were not so familiar. And then also his aging and the process of aging and of losing one's footing. That was very key to me. And I felt that very, very powerfully. The other night I gave a talk and somebody asked me about the process of reading the diary and working on him. And I said that if I had been asked to do this, say, 10 years ago, I don't know if I would have plunged in quite so quickly, and I don't know that I would have had the tools. I'm just much more sympathetic as I look around at the process of aging and the consequences of aging and what happens to celebrity and fame and one's sense of oneself and the demands that an aging body makes on one's psyche. And I just I felt for him. I really felt for him. And I don't know that 10 years ago, I would have had that depth of emotional access. So those are things I don't think people expect to read it, but it turns out to be very touching because he seems to be such a protean figure and somebody who's so emotion free, and all in his head, which he is, but he also has another side. And I wanted to show that too. So that's a long-winded answer to a question as to what I decided to wear. It's just things that touched me that I saw more clearly and that rendered him a full-throttled person, not just a man who tosses off ideas a minute. And it was a very difficult personality. So that added to the process too.
Yeah, what you say reminds me of something that's come up in a lot of our conversations with academics who've gone to writing more trade press types of books. And this book too, is for everyone really, academics and general readers, that they use quotations differently. And I guess as you were speaking about the accessing his feelings about aging, I'm imagining you found things in the diary and letters. Because he's such a great writer, were you tempted to really do a lot of extensive quoting, or how did you deal with his words?
I had to rein that in because though I found his published writings rather glum, and sometimes you needed a sledgehammer to get at them, or I did. At any rate, the diary is a very different kind of writer. He's witty, he's cranky, he has a gimlet eye, and who better to reflect on one's state of self than he. On the other hand, I didn't want to simply be a ventriloquist and to put down what he said. On the other hand, I had a lot of hands here. On the other hand, I couldn't do it better. I was very mindful of making sure that every quote that I took from him packed a wallop, that every quote just had weight to it and resonance to it, so that the book was not studded with things that were lifted from. I was tempted because they were so good, but there were moments where I had to sit on my hands or restrain myself or just try and balance a paraphrase. But if I found that he said it so well, better than I could, let him say it rather than I did, and especially on the more personal things. I mean, who am I? But he would say it. I remember there was a moment where he is living in Israel, and this is a guy who's accustomed to running the show, especially his family's Passover Seder, and he's invited to his brother-in-law's Seder, and they're all by now quite Israeli and quite secular, and so they do things very differently. And he actually brings copies of his own Haggadah, thinking that they would use it, and they don't, and he's very put out. And he talks about being put out, but I thought in that case, I would be able to punch it up in a way. He just looks like a cranky old man, and so I didn't want to put him in that light. But I could say certain things, how it appeared to me, how he's responding to not being the center of attention. But in other instances, if he said it really well, let him say it.
Yeah, thinking about what kind of light you put him into reminds me, as you mentioned, I think in the acknowledgments, he's still got living family members, descendants. And I'm curious how that was for you.
Oh, fun. They were extremely generous, extremely generous. I would talk loosely about what I had in mind. They're all extremely talented and very gifted and very strong personalities. They are, what's that old adage about the acorn in the tree? They very much lived up to that. I didn't want to get their approval per se. I mean, I didn't want to do anything to annoy, irritate, disappoint, and I hope I didn't. But I would kind of throw things out and just sort of see how they responded. There were a lot of times when I'd ask questions they were funny questions, silly questions, day-to-day questions, like what did he wear at the Shabbat table, and what was his talit like, and how did his voice sound, and did he crack jokes, and things like that, which only family members, but they're all pretty young at the time, so they have grandpa memories, which are very different than grown-up memories. And then there were some sensitive, tense issues. So I'd get a sense from them when I could press and when I couldn't. And in general, they were very, 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 very helpful and very eager to have Kaplan back in circulation. I think they feel that his star has been completely eclipsed, if not erased. So this was a great opportunity. So they opened all sorts of doors, especially photographically. They were quite terrific. There were tons and tons of photographs. After all, we lived a very long life. But Yale has a limit on the number of photographs, so I wasn't able to use. And some of them were very beautiful in color. I couldn't use those either. So that was disappointing. But I was mindful, I should say in response, I was mindful that not only was Cleo, the muse of history, sitting on my shoulder, but there were a lot of Kaplan people right behind Cleo. And not that I had to answer to them, but I had to be mindful of how this might land. And it just makes you aware of the power of your language, but did not constrain me.
Jen, I wanted to ask you about external readers. This is something that often comes up in our conversations. Who is helping us? Who's, by looking at our work, giving us feedback at different stages at this point in your career? I wonder if you figured out if there's an especially good time for you to be showing your work to colleagues or friends.
I don't. I talk it out a lot, and I try to present as often as possible, and maybe even publish ahead of time. So, I published a piece in the Jewish Review of Books, and the process of going over that piece with Abe Soker, the very astute editor, was extremely helpful. But I would say that my chief interlocutor is my husband, who's not an academic, but loves to read and is a kind of proto-historian and is a big fan of Kaplan. And so I would say while I was reading the diaries almost every night, we'd have and I write this in the acknowledgments, we'd have a nightly debrief, and it would be a situation where he'd ask me, I would tell him something, I found this great quote, and he would say, is that forest or trees? It was a very helpful exercise that made me decide, and he would read a lot. As I'd complete a chapter, he would read, and we'd talk about it endlessly. And maybe a couple of colleagues, but over the years, I've just become somebody happy with a very limited circle of input. And this may sound arch or something, but I kind of trust to my instincts. But that's a long time. And so I kind of trust to myself. I was concerned here that I was a little too close, maybe. And the forest and the trees exercise was a very good device to, yeah. So that may be disappointing to your readers who love to have lots of, I know a lot of colleagues and a lot of wonderful writers have writing circles and constantly, but I don't. And I trusted to the process and to my editors at the end that they would set me right.
And it's a very lucky thing when you have that in-house kind of counsel there too.
Yeah, in-house counsel, that's a good word. In-house counsel, yeah.
Jenna, you've published popular pieces on Jewish history and culture, I think, for decades now. And I'm wondering, what's your interest in this kind of writing and publishing?
Oh, I loved it. So for 25 years, I published monthly columns, first in the Forward and then in Tablet. And these days, I'm a contributing writer for the Jewish Review of Books, so I get to do a lot of that too. And what I did was to work on short pieces, generally about 1,500 words, maybe 2,000, that may not have lent themselves to a full-fledged monograph, but certainly were intriguing, quirky, revelatory about one or another aspect of American Jewish life, and caught my fancy. And I thought, American Jews really know very little about their patrimony, and what they do know is rather hackneyed. And so here's a chance just to expand the horizon and to suggest what a rich and complicated and at times really quirky patrimony we are heir to. And so I loved finding a topic. Every one I did, which is kind of an amazing thing as I look back and continue to do this, every one is based on original research. It's not like I recycled stuff. I had to go out and there was a moment in time where the turnaround was so quick. I'd write them and then they'd be edited and then I'd have to re-edit and then I'd have to write. It'd be like every 2 weeks. So I would say that it really kept me on my toes. It alerted me to how much is out there, how rich and complicated and delicious this culture is, and troubling. And it also kept me trim. It just kept me constantly writing every 2 weeks and then editing. And so there were times when it was hard. It was really hard because there'd be a lot on my plate and school, teaching, grading, all of that. But it just kept me going. It kept me alert and interested in the culture to which I lay claim, and helped me with my writing. The other thing I should point out is that I did that alongside the writing of books. So it wasn't as if it was an alternative venue for me. It was a supplemental venue, but it just helped in thinking about audience, pacing, content. It's great. It was just great. And it deepened my own understanding of what it is to write history and helped me, be a kind of public intellectual without weighing in on politics, but weighing in on American Jewish life. So I recommend it. If it comes your way, do it. It's not easy. It's not easy to find topics on which people haven't written, or I have to go digging in archives or primary sources. But these days, so much is available online, and there's no shortage of topics. And so much of American Jewish history and culture remains unexplored. So, yeah, I did that. And I fell into that too. That wasn't something that I had set out to do. I was asked on the heels of the success of my Wonders of America book, which was all about daily life and the stuff of daily life. And the Forward's editor at the time, Andrew Silo Caro, had this great idea. Let's do a column, called it The Wonders of America. And there's another instance where I didn't really know what I was getting into, but off I went, and what a boon that turned out to be. And it just strengthened me as a historian and made me not so fearful of the page and eager to jump in, tackle, think through.
Yeah, that Wonders of America book. I'm just remembering in college, John Butler at Yale loved that book. I feel like decades of us college students came to learn the interestingness of American Jewish history because of that. I always think of that as the matzah book. It has this beautiful cover that, or at least I think the paperback.
That edition did. Yeah, that edition did. Yeah, that was a great one. Yeah. So I was really lucky. These opportunities come along and you could either seize them or take a hike. And I chose to seize them, not fully understanding what I was getting into, but was just so grateful. So very grateful. And it really made me into a much better historian and brought me into a different orbit, just keeps you fresh.
I wonder if you can tell us about a typical writing day or week, especially because you do so much writing. How does this all fit in?
I work all the time, but it's in between teaching, and I do have a life, though. But I would say I work all the time. I don't have a typical day, but I'm always writing in one way or another, always writing. And yeah, I wish I could say, I get up at 5 and I work from 5 to 9, and then I take a break, and then I go back, and then I go for a run, and then I make lunch, and but somehow I'm always writing. And sometimes it is 5 a.m, and sometimes it's very late at night, but it's always writing, especially when one has a book and a deadline. And with these articles, you always have a deadline. So that keeps you on your toes too.
Yeah.
I goof around too. I don't want your listeners to think that I don't. I goof around, and I do. I do go to museums. They're grist for my mills. Go to plays. Go to the ballet all the time. So those are little breaks. But then more writing.
Yeah, actually, when I had a fellowship in New York, I guess a year ago, and I remember seeing you at some of the events at Center for Jewish History, and I was impressed that not everyone still goes to sort of book events and author talks, but you go. And for you, what are those helpful, or it's just always interesting if it's a new book?
It's always interesting. It's always stimulating to see colleagues up front and close and up front. And very often you get insights into the books that you don't get on the page. And there's always hope for some stimulating conversation that you may not have at your own university. I mean, all of these things are ways to stimulate and expand and make sure that you don't get stuck in your little rut and just listen to your own prattling on. So, yeah. But I went to yours and I go to a couple of others, but they have to be special. I don't go to every single one. Although now there's the opportunity, you can listen online and so much going on, so much going on. So there's no shortage of activities or podcasts to listen to. So they're all good. They're all grist for the mill and a way to make you enjoy the abundance that is the historical enterprise.
It's been a long career, and so I'm just curious what you've noticed has changed in book publishing in recent years.
Oh, God. Yeah. It's changed enormously. Fewer and fewer publishers, fewer and fewer opportunities for people just starting out to publish. The review mechanisms have changed. Fewer and fewer outlets are reviewing. Instead, they go for interviews or feature pieces, or as I discovered with the Kaplan book, I just written this book and I was asked repeatedly by a number of venues to write something. But I just wrote something, what? Excerpt it, but they'd want me to write something about writing something. It's all very mediated, very postmodern. Write something about the process of writing something, that kind of thing. But there are fewer places, to do that kind of long form writing. That's another consequence. So it's just really hard. On the other hand, there are so many webinars and podcasts and the ability to create one's own podcast without having to go through established channels. I mean, that's quite revolutionary. And there are so many more communities and groups. But in terms of the attention, and look, Washington Post's book review section, which was so important, is no more. So many of them are folding or thinning out. You look at the New York Times book review, it's so thin, so thin. There's no daily anymore. So the opportunities to cast a wider net with reviews is dwindling or has dwindled or is no more. So that's changed enormously. On the other hand, the good news is that the range of topics that people are exploring and that get published, maybe in tiny amounts, but they get published, is quite terrific. So there is more opportunity for play. I don't mean, silly play, but thinking of inventive ways to harvest a theme. That's changed, and for the better. And people are more open, except the mechanisms by which they express their openness, even though they're more open, has dried up. So maybe that'll come back. I don't know.
There's two questions we ask all guests, and one is, what is something you wish you could tell your earlier career stage self about writing or publishing?
Yeah, I was thinking about that question, and I'd like to switch it a little bit and to say not to myself or to my junior colleagues, but to my senior colleagues a little something, and that is just be open. I mean, at this stage of the game, I never imagined that I'd be writing a biography, and it was just the most stellar experience and brought to bear everything else that I've been working on. So to my senior colleagues, I would say just keep on trucking, and if opportunities for doing something that has not been part of your portfolio comes along, do it. As for my junior colleagues, keep the faith. It's just so hard. And cultivate and go to as many things as possible and try to find venues to get your voice out and to find collaborative opportunities and to think imaginatively, to think broadly, to see museums as a friend and not just as a competitor, to think of other venues in which one could share one's ideas. I know Jim Leffler had mentioned community groups. They're also very useful. And don't hold your nose up at adult education or things of that sort. They're very lively and very helpful. And so the more just harness as many devices as you can and think warmly of your audiences.
You mentioned before that you kind of had the biography bug. Is there another project along those lines?
I wish. Oh, I hope some of your listeners might have some grand ideas. I don't have anything quite yet, and I'm feeling very bereft. I feel bereft. I hope. I always feel that way at the end of the book. I'm very, busy with Kaplan now, but I know that's going to end soon. And then what? I have lots of smaller projects, but nothing that's going to sweep me off my feet and engage me in quite the same way. And I know it's silly of me. I'm not going to find a project quite like this. So to entertain the hope that I will is barking up the wrong tree. But I do hope that I'll be able to find another project, and preferably a biography, a subject who has a diary or who has been a very avid letter writer, or just because in the case of the Kaplan, the knowledge the pre-knowledge, the advanced knowledge that there was this remarkable diary, and that Kaplan had a front row seat at virtually every single major American Jewish initiative of the 20th century. And I had used the diary just a wee bit when I was first starting out, when I had published a book on the origins of New York's modern Orthodox community. And Kaplan had been front and center there too. And I knew from those diaries, having worked on them way long ago, that they were really juicy, and that his pen was not sparing, let's say. So that just made it so much sweeter. And it provided the backbone for the book. I knew there was material. That's the thing, you really want great material. So I knew that there was material. And so diaries, there 10,000 pages of correspondence, all of his sermons. I knew there were archives. So you need the stuff. And at the end of the day, you're as good as your stuff. And if you don't have glorious material, you could make it up, I guess, and I could become a novelist. But I don't see that. I never say never, but I don't see that. So if you have any bright ideas, or the more speculative, the better, just bring them on. I'm so open to something.
Yeah, I'm curious if anyone's working on something on Cynthia Ozick, someone else who must have a lot of writing. And
I'm sure.
I feel like I actually don't know much about her personal life, but yeah, I'm sure that you will find another subject.
I hope so. I hope so, because this was such great fun. I knew I'd have a grand time, but I didn't realize the extent to which I had such a marvelous, transformative time working on this. And so I miss the intensity. I miss getting up at 2 a.m. and making my way to the diaries, which were digitized. They were not great in terms of digitization. It was done a long time ago, so they were not search engine friendly. So you had to read everything. But I love that. Especially at 2 a.m. It kept me company during some very dark days in our history. So that was grand. And then just reckoning with a person and trying to figure out what made him tick. And what was he up to, and what did he hope to accomplish, and what was he doing, and what were his co-religionists doing? It's grand, absolutely grand. So, in a certain way, if this is my valedictory, that's okay too.
Another question that we ask guests is if there's a writing habit or practice that works for you.
Reading a lot of other people's works. Just exposing myself to lots of writing. Always reading. In part because I'm on the train a lot. I live in New York and I commute to DC, and so the train ride isn't a hop, skip, and a jump. It's at least 3 hours, so I have to and fro. So I have a lot of opportunity to catch up on some stellar reading. So that helps, and it just galvanizes, intrigues, makes you jealous, all of those good things. So that would be a writing process. And just writing all the time. Just writing, just don't wait for some great opportunity. Just keep at it, right? I mean, do you have a writing practice?
I guess starting in the morning before I feel like I'm totally awake, just getting into it is, I just find that's helpful before I start to be sort of emotional and thinking about how things are actually going. Just doing it is working very well for me.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a cliche, and I'm sure many of your other guests have made the point, but it's a muscle, and you just have to keep at it all the time, just to make sure that you're in the right shape.
Well, thank you so much, Jenna. This has been really a lot of fun and really interesting. I'm so grateful to you.
Thank you. Well, I'm grateful to you for having me and for orchestrating this series. It's quite a wonderful service to the profession. And it's great fun to make explicit what one does. While you're doing it, you're just tumbling from one to another, and sort of step back a little bit now that it's out and it's had a life and it's making noise, to think about what you did.
Yeah.
Doing it. So I thank you very much for the opportunity, and hope your listeners had a good time.
Yes. Congratulations on the book.
Thanks so much, Rachel. Take care now.
Thanks for listening to Writing It, the podcast about academics and writing, sponsored by the Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Florida. Visit our podcast description to find out how to contact us and send us your questions about academic writing and publishing. Follow us on social media at Writing It Pod, and subscribe to us so you never miss an episode.